Wow, so wonderful to lead with you, Erin and Joyce Rosenzweig. And Monday night, Joyce and Cantor Rosen and I will be leading the CBST Seder. For those of you who have already registered, fabulous. We're sold out, but it will be online. So you get to sit at home in your pajamas, eating your own food with your own Seder plate and following along with us. And we'll have a link for the HaGadol online, so you could follow along and participate that way. Or those of you who will be here with us in person. Both ways are a wonderful way to observe together. And so many people have come up to me, Dennis, in this week to talk about the impact you've had on this community. And it's wonderful that you get to be here this week before you head back to Oregon to be in a little lesser pressurized situation. And for me personally, as I said last week in some of our closing remarks, what an extraordinary gift you as a community have given to me. And I really have not yet come up with the words to express what it means to me to be able to share Dennis and Sharon with the community and to share the community with you. But I think all of you got a taste of it, right? Of what he means to me and how deeply you've influenced me since I first walked into your classroom 47 years ago. So this is Shabbat HaGadol, as I mentioned, which is the Shabbat in which we are told we focus on the themes, the content, how to observe Pesach. And this year, for me, that comes to some very central ideas that I want to explore a little bit with you tonight. And maybe in your Sedarim, in your Seders, this will be a conversation that you'll have. So there are multiple levels of this, and it's impossible for me to stand here tonight and not talk a little bit about what's happening on my alma mater's campus this week. And Dennis went there today to experience it directly, what's happening at Columbia University. And it is a microcosm. I don't believe this is happening on every college campus in America, and I think that is a little bit overblown, but it is happening on some. And the thing that struck me the most, which is one of the profound themes of Pesach, and as I mentioned last week, of what we do when we enter into the high holidays, is how do we actually achieve freedom? How do we actually achieve the agenda of liberation? How do we actually get from slavery to freedom? How do we actually free ourselves and others? What's the blueprint? What's the roadmap? What's the owner's manual to getting out of slavery and getting to freedom? And in the story of Pesach, I think we have gems of pieces of the roadmap that have a lot to teach us. First of all, we have the piece that reminds us we have been slaves, so we know what it is to be slaves, and we have to make sure others don't experience that. 36 times, more than anything else is said in all of the Bible, it's told that we're supposed to remember we were slaves. And we're also given the model of what Pharaoh is like. And Arthur Waskow some years ago said, maybe part of the point of the Pesach Seder is that we also have to learn not to be Pharaoh. That there's both the model of what it is to be a victim and what it is to be the perpetrator. And it turns out that life is really complicated. And we all know that in our personal lives, right? Some of the greatest people we know are also schmucks in some form. And that's the reality. And let's just be honest, some of us are those combinations, right? There are ways that we are some of the most evolved, deeply evolved people, and we all have parts of us that, how shall we say, are embarrassing and horrible. Not you, Shep, of course. You're 100%. You're number. So the first thing is that we have to learn to hold multiple truths at once, which we live in a world which is entirely positioned against that. We live in a world of social media which says, if you can't say it in a couple of angry words or in a tweet or in a post, then, oh my God, I don't want to get that deep. I don't want to get that complicated. But the story of the Passover story is a very complicated one. The Jews are both victims, and then they are horrible at points of the journey. They act in ways that are horrific. The victims themselves act in terrible ways. And I read from Professor Dalton's book, which, how many people here have ordered it this week? Several people have to see. How many hands are up here, Dennis? Gandhi has a vital element. Gandhi's conception of freedom has a vital element. The conviction that tyranny over another inevitably corrupts the character of the tyrant and so enslaves the tyrant himself. And in Gandhi's world, he really understood that the struggle for the liberation of the Indians would ultimately also liberate the British. Now, what did that mean in practical terms? And now I feel kind of foolish speaking in front of Dennis Dalton, so if I make a mistake, correct me. Do not hesitate to correct me. Gandhi believed not in destroying the British, but helping them to also become liberated, and helping them to understand what they were doing was destroying not just Indians, but their own souls. That is a completely different level of understanding. So Gandhi treated every British person, whether it was a police or a soldier, with respect. When he was arrested, he made a point of treating every arresting officer, no matter how brutalized he was, and he was brutalized, and his people were brutalized. He maintained his job was to always try to, maybe this is the wrong word, but convert the other, not destroy the other. And even if the other was being brutal to him, even if the other was the viceroy of the empire in India, Gandhi would very firmly say, I'm sorry, but I'm going to do this, but I'm being, and he would do it in a way that was deeply respectful. We have lost this ability in the world today. And as much as there might be goals of the lefts clamoring for the liberation of Palestine, and as much as everybody here knows how much I stand for the liberation of Palestinians, the language of these protests is anathema to the liberation of anyone. And I am completely horrified by the language of the protests, the language of the signs, and the language of the chants. This will not achieve liberation of anyone. This will create an environment of hate that will only succeed in reversing who's in a position of power. And we've seen this in so many movements, that when a movement for liberation overthrows a tyrannical government, how many times have those movements become tyrannical? They've just replaced the particular people who are in power, but they haven't actually gotten rid of the tyranny. How can we be part of a movement that says we stand for the liberation of Palestinians, that remains compassionate towards Jews and believes in the future of the Jewish people? How can we demand the liberation of Jews that understands our liberation is totally tied up in the liberation of Palestinians? There will be no freedom for Jews in Israel without the freedom of Palestinians. And the language that the extreme Jewish supremacists in Israel use is completely anathema to Jewish safety. And the language that those who are advocating for the freedom of Palestinians, which is likewise full of violence in the language, is anathema to ultimately the safety of Palestinians. A close friend of mine, a rabbi, whose daughter is a freshman at Columbia, she said that as Jewish students passed the protests yesterday, I didn't hear whether it happened today, but Dennis said he was there today as well, and if a Jew passed the protests with a kippah, the crowds broke out in a chant. Kill yourself. Kill yourself. Kill yourself. How have we come to a movement that's for the liberation of Palestinians who absolutely have been victimized, has turned into a movement of language? Not everybody in that movement, but language that's full of hate, that's full of violence. This is not the way. This is not the way. How is it that we have Jewish supremacists in Israel? A horrible situation where a 15-year-old Jewish boy was killed, and it's horrible on the West Bank. But what did the Jewish supremacists do in response? This week, I'm not talking about, they led pogroms burning down Palestinian villages in the West Bank. 5 Palestinians were killed. Cars were burned. Houses were burned. Mosques were burned. Both of these are not going to achieve the liberation of anyone. And this Pesach, our Passover story, teaches us the deep and profound truth. There is no way to peace. Peace is the way. The ends do not justify the means. One of the things that I learned deeply from my study with Dennis Dalton and my study of Gandhi is that we have to prepare ourselves. The spotlight has to start by going inside. And if we are using language that dehumanizes the other, that is a signal. That is a red light. That is a flashing light. This is not the way. If we use language that says the problem is the other side and never our side, that's a good signal also. It's unlikely to have truth there. And as Dennis described so powerfully last week, the Amritsar massacre was such a brutal series of atrocities. And yet Gandhi remained committed to understand that to replay that set of atrocities against the British would not succeed in the liberation of his people. That the liberation has to be this deeper understanding of what humanity requires from us. Now, it's possible to completely disagree and believe that the only way to achieve freedom is going to be through military force, whether it's Hamas terrorists or other kinds of force, like bombing Gaza. And I am very sympathetic to the intense pain and suffering that exists among Israeli Jews and the fear. But we know from this country's perspective, it rarely works. It never works, actually, military force in these situations. That it creates a fertile ground for the evil of terrorism to find an audience. This level of preparation, as Gandhi taught over and over again, doesn't happen easily. It takes deep spiritual preparation to be able to say, I'm not only going to react because I got punched in the nose punching back. And that great movie about Harvey Milk, that documentary, I've forgotten the name of it. Anybody remember that great? What? The Life and Times of Harvey Milk. Do you remember that fantastic documentary? That, what's her name? I should have looked this up. The woman who is interviewed after the Harvey Milk's murderer is released or gets this ridiculous Twinkie defense and gets free. And her first reaction, she said, is, you know what? I agreed with everybody that said, let's burn down City Hall. And then she said, you know what? That's not what Harvey would have wanted. We have to find a way to respond that speaks to our best selves, that rises us up to a level that shows the world what we imagine the world to be, not just imitates the violence of, who was Harvey Milk's killer? Dan White. And that becomes a deep question. How do we create a movement that says both in the way we talk to each other, we create a possibility of humanizing the process? Now, I know there's a whole movement, and Dennis and I talked about this at dinner, of civility being a product of the right wing somehow. That treating people decently is only perpetrating the power structure. And we have to be willing to be uncivil and tear down those power structures. I reject that. Just like I reject their binaries of if you're pro-Palestinian, you're anti-Israel, or if you're pro-Israel, you're anti-Palestinian. Those binaries are false choices. And we have to insist on the imagination of another way. That is not easy. All you have to do is try saying that on social media. Watch what happens to me on social media when I say anything like that. That's not easy to do. But I'm very proud to feel like I'm part of a movement that now exists, mostly not here in the United States, where we have the protests for Palestinians are deeply anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Jewish. In Israel, there is this incredible movement of Palestinians and Jews insisting on a third way. Is it the majority? Not yet. But you know what? We Jews, we're 0.5% of the world's population. It makes me nuts when people say, well, how many people actually believe that? We're small, numbered people. The question is, do we have the power to start with shining that spotlight on ourselves and insisting on this other way? We've brought them, I've tried to expose CBST as much as possible this year to these people who are the real heroes. They're the real chalutzim in Israel. They're really digging out the swamps of hate and mistrust and inequality. Was Israel founded with a lot of mistakes? Yes, it was. Was everybody who founded Israel a colonialist? That's ridiculously not true. America was founded on slavery and on genocide, but we insist on a dream of what America could be. Dr. King painted a picture of that dream and insisted on America living up to that dream. That's what we have to do. It takes imagination and it takes a lot of patience. Paro is an idea, not just a character in history. And Paro's heart gets hardened over and over again to the obvious suffering of the Israelites. It was not hidden, it was obvious. And that ability to not get our hearts hardened in a moment when everybody has compassion fatigue, the world is so messed up. But it starts with the language we use and the way we talk about the situation and the ability to imagine. And yes, sometimes we need Palestinians and Israelis to show us the way, because in America, it has gotten bonkers. And if you're not supporting the Free Palestine movement 1,000%, you're a colonialist or you're a right-wing fascist. You support the fascist government of Israel. I don't think anybody here would argue that I'm very critical of the state of Israel. You've heard me say that a few times, right? But let's use an example that Rabbi Jill Jacobs mentioned this week to me in a conversation we had. Nobody would argue that it's okay to criticize China for the brutality, the genocide, the concentration camps in which China keeps 1 million Uyghur Muslims. 1 million Uyghur Muslims are in labor camps and concentration camps. Nobody would argue with the importance of criticizing the country, the government, the leader of that government. But would anybody say it's okay to boycott a Chinese restaurant in New York City? Would anybody say, because of what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghurs, it's okay to not eat, it's okay to boycott Chinese food? It's ludicrous. But we're living in a city now where Israeli restaurants are being vandalized, red paint being thrown on Israeli restaurants and boycotted. Anybody who, anything that has an Israeli flag is seen as open, open target, open season. That is the difference between being anti the government of the state of Israel and anti-Semitism. And we have to, it's very complicated. I do not believe the response to anti-Semitism is just to scream and yell. Guess what? I don't think that's so successful. But I do think we have a legitimate right to say we have to create a movement for social change that does not do what many movements for social change have done, which is sacrifice the Jews. Not only with Dennis Dalton, and I mentioned last week that I had 2 very important mentors when I was at Barnard. One was Dennis Dalton, and the other was Paula Hyman, who died very young from breast cancer, unfortunately, the great Jewish historian, one of the most important modern Jewish historians, feminist. And she taught a class on Jews and revolution. And I took the class. There were like 10 of us in the class. 9 were Orthodox Jews. They took every class that had the word Jews in it. And I was the only one who took the class because the word revolution was in the title also. And the other 9 didn't talk very much. They just kind of took notes. And I had a personal one-on-one seminar with Paula Hyman for the semester. And she's a European historian. We went through every single European revolution, the big ones, the German Revolution in the 1800s, the French Revolution in the 1700s, the Russian Revolution in the 1900s. And in every single revolution, the revolutionaries blamed the Jews for being reactionaries and for representing the status quo, and the status quo blamed the Jews for being the revolutionaries in all 3 of those major European revolutions. So this isn't something new, but it has a unique texture to it because there's now a state of Israel. And that state is a majority Jewish state. So we are in a very, 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 very difficult time because this is a new situation where there's a state where it could be legitimate to criticize a state for its policies. We do it all the time here in America, right? We're pretty comfortable criticizing when America does something wrong. But I have not heard somebody say, therefore, America should not exist. So the question becomes, but there's an urge sometimes in the Jewish community to not criticize Israel at all because you don't want to be associated. Isn't it hard, right? It's like, how do you do this? This is why we need to start with small communities where we can actually say and explore and interrogate and ask questions because nobody understands all of this. But the world that the far left has now created makes it almost impossible to ask a question of inquiry, a question of curiosity, a question of, I don't know, how would this be? And for this, I am heartbroken. This is not intellectual. This is not at a level of really serious discourse. We're at a place that if you don't say the right thing, and honestly, this happens on all directions, you're immediately cast as X or Y. There's no room to be intellectually curious without knowing what the answer to your question is. In Dennis Dalton's class, every question was a valuable question in order to explore what the ideas were and to figure out, and guess what? You don't always know what the right answer is because that was what intellectual curiosity has as its definition. How do we reclaim that? First of all, don't be afraid. We have to find places to have these kinds of discussions and debate. Dennis told me a story the first time he met Malcolm X and tried to approach him and talk about the fact that he was a fellow traveler and supported the movement towards the liberation of black people in America. And Malcolm X tossed him aside and said, "You're a white dude, you're not welcome here." The next time, I think it was 2 weeks before Malcolm X was assassinated. And if you've read Malcolm X's autobiography, which I did in Dennis's class and studied it very closely, Malcolm X goes through a transformation in his life from being one could argue even a black supremacist and seeing no role for white people in the world, to going through a transformation that by the end of his life, and one could even argue might even be the reason he was assassinated, by the end of his life he understood that if there was going to be liberation of black people, there had to be liberation of white people, and that there could not be this sense of all white people are evil and all black people are pure. And what did he say to you that last time you met him 2 weeks before he was assassinated? Join me, brother, in this march to freedom. So may we all become that liberated in this season of Passover to be able to look around and look at each other and say, join me, brother, on this march to freedom. Shabbat Shalom. May this be a sweet Passover full of liberation, full of questions, by the way. The Seder is a night of questions. And in fact, the HaGadol we use is called a night of questions. It's not necessarily a season of answers. So let's keep asking the questions with honesty and with integrity, and most importantly, with love. Shabbat Shalom.